So welcome to this presentation on the stock market in 2023 and onwards also. And as you can see from the image here, this is, what I'm predicting. I have been predicting this for a while, since last year. And that's not really a hard prediction, but I find it interesting that not a lot of astrologers are actually making that call. And I realize that maybe I'm sticking my neck out a bit in doing that, but when you see the astrology I'm about to show you, you will sort of look at it and think, well, how could it be any other way? So we're having a major repeating pattern here that has been, throughout the years. We're always having stock market crashes. It's not like unheard of. It's so common. But I think this one is going to be a bit more impactful, and I think it's going to change the story in a bigger way than recent ones, maybe even more than the 2008 one. And I'll show you why that is. Before we get started, I think it's always a good idea to chant to Ganesh, the Lord of Vedic Astrology, the Lord that removes our obstacles. And certainly this is an important time to do that. Even when you think about Ganesh ruling computers and computer code and language, and we can, link that with cryptocurrency. And you might even say, therefore, that Ganesh rules cryptocurrency. So when we think about that, Ganesh might seem like this sort of very traditional Indian deity that has no application at all to our modern life, but in actual fact, cryptocurrency obviously does. So this is a very simple mantra you can chant to Ganesh. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. So just maybe I'll describe this because I often say this without describing. So the Gang is the seed mantra. And then when you have an M sound followed by a G sound, the is more pronounced to the back of the throat. So it often is written as G-O-N-G or G-A-N, as in Gung or Gung. So if you make an M sound but to the back of your throat, it's going to end up sounding like that. Om Gung. And then Ganapatiye is Ganesh, another name for Ganesh. And then Namah. So before I get started into this, just a reminder that I do use sidereal calculations. And so if you're used to the tropical zodiac, well, all you have to do is subtract 24 degrees at present. In a lot of these charts that I'm going to show you and the historic crashes that we're going to go through, it would have been 23 degrees by most accounts at the time. It's shifted in our lifetime to 24 degrees. There is, though, some difference in that. Some astrologers use 22 to 24. So there's a range, and this is called the Ayan Amsha. So also a disclaimer here that this video is for, I have to say this, for YouTube. This video is for entertainment purposes only, but it's not very entertaining to talk about a stock market crash, I guess. But none of this information, of course, is a substitute for professional advice. I'm not an economist. So that's one thing I want to say. So let me just make sure everybody's muted. So let's get into it. This is what I wrote in the first paragraph of my predictions, my 2023 timelines. And I wrote this back in 2022. So I published it in December of 2022. So I've been talking about this for a while. I usually look at the year ahead, by the time it's sort of we get into the autumn of the previous year, I start looking more into the year ahead in a more in-depth way. So every year brings its challenges and rewards. Some years bring more challenges and more rewards. 2023 is one of those years, it seems. War, natural disasters, and energy crisis. These are all things that are ongoing. And major economic adjustment, possibly even a major stock market crash after further inflation. It's all happening. So this is the issue here, actually, and I'll show you again the transits that I'm referring to when I say this kind of further inflationary sort of cycle and a bubble that's been created that leads to the crash potentially then in October, November. So what's happening now and what will happen in the coming weeks and in the summer and all the volatility through the summer is what leads to that downturn by the autumn, I believe. So you can read all about that, the timelines in the magazine. It's a free magazine online. You can read it at timelineastrology.com. So before we get into any of the astrology, though, I just want to backtrack a little bit and just highlight that actually there's a lot more to wealth than just money. And I think if you're just to look at wealth as money, then that's a problem, because money comes and money goes. And if you don't always have money, then, what are you going to fall back on? So in Vedic culture, they're seen as 8 forms of wealth, not just one, not just money. So there's, first of all, spiritual wealth or liberation. There's the obvious material wealth most people think about when they think about the word wealth. There's the wealth of food, animals. Obviously, this is in terms of traditional Vedic culture, but it's still relevant to us today. Children, as in our offspring, our lineage, courage, the wealth of courage, to be able to do anything, to take risks, especially for those who are dealing in the markets. The wealth of success in any kind of way, not just material success. And then finally, knowledge, which I have a proclivity for. I am more focused on knowledge. For me, wealth is knowledge. But at the same time, we shouldn't obviously just focus on one, because there are 8 forms of wealth. So, and they can express themselves in very different ways according to how you live. You might not necessarily have children, and that might express itself in creativity, for example. That's another correlation there with children. Whatever way it expresses for you, it's important that you don't just have one form of wealth in your life. So let's get into this astrology. So I wrote about this in the article Black Swan Event on my website, and I just again highlight this here. The Black Swan theory was developed by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and that's his book. It's Black Swan theory. And so a black swan, what is it? Basically, it's something that happens out of the blue, and it's unexpected and unpredictable, which even in astrological terms, you might say it's a bit more predictable, but we still don't really know what's going to happen. But there's one coming very soon. So the attributes, the 3 major attributes that a black swan event has. First, it's an outlier, as it lies outside the realm of regular expectations, because nothing in the past can convincingly point to its possibility. Now, we could argue that we have patterns that are repeating here, and I'll show you that we can actually predict that there is going to be something. And therefore, is it really a black swan? I don't know. And that's another point I want to make here before we get into it. Like in the past, we didn't have such up-to-date knowledge about the markets and what's happening in the economy, like at your fingertips on your smartphone, like 24/7. So it's like most people are aware that there's something coming down the line at this point, I imagine, and it's not going to be that surprising, and therefore not a black swan. But there could also be something that happens, especially by the end of May, June time, because this is when there's a configuration occurring that will line up with this. And I'll show you this. So that's the first thing. It has to be an outlier. It's like out of the realms of, what you expect. The second thing is it has to carry an extreme impact. So that's another one. Third, then, in spite of its outlier status, human nature makes us concoct explanations for its occurrence after the fact, making it explainable and predictable. So, well, isn't that what astrologers do all the time? Even if astrologers don't predict something in the future, anytime an astrologer is looking at a birth chart and makes any comment about a birth chart, that's actually a prediction, because it's after the fact. And I think a lot of people forget that fact, that a birth chart obviously is at the time of someone's birth. So anything you say about it afterwards has happened after that. So it's sort of like a prediction, even if you're talking about the past. Anyway, when you live in my world and the world of astrology, all the past and present and future all kind of meld into one. So this is a photo I took in Galway in 2017. This is actually a black swan that flew into Galway. It made the news, of course, but we've never seen a black swan in Galway. It was swimming amongst all the white swans. They're quite famous in the Claddagh, in this area in Galway. And I took a photo of it, and it was like a big deal. I think it was soon after or before. I can't remember, was it before or after? I think it was after. There was a massive fire in a local area, and it cast this huge plume of smoke, and it like darkened the skies. It was that big. And I don't know, I kind of read it like that. I thought this was an omen for that, and that's all it was. But the thing is, there was a lot going on in 2017. And so what happened, of course, in 2016 was that Uranus moved into Sidereal Aries before this black swan here moved into Galway. And then we know what happened in 2016. And I'm going to show you, all of this in the charts and all of that. But another thing that happened in 2016 was that Jupiter and Rahu conjoined in Leo. And this is the black swan. You could literally call this combination a black swan yoga. I mean, and the reason I'm saying that is because Jupiter and Rahu in Indian traditional astrology is called Guru Chandala Yoga. Guru is Jupiter, the guide, the advisor, the wise Jupiter. And Rahu is Chandal. It's a shadow. So it's the shadow over this wise Jupiter. And literally, the swan is linked to Jupiter because Jupiter has this yoga, Hamsa yoga is called in Indian astrology, where Jupiter in its own sign or exalted in an angle creates this very powerful combination where somebody portrays all of the more positive traits of Jupiter, of wisdom, knowledge, of coherence and unity, and just knowing what is right and righteousness. And when you put Rahu with Jupiter, it creates this Guru Chandala Yoga or Black Swan Yoga, literally like a black swan. So this is not lost on an astrologer when you see a black swan move into your neighborhood and you see after having Jupiter Rahu conjoined in Leo. And by the way, they conjoined in Leo for months because Jupiter and Rahu were going retrograde together for months and months all summer. So of course, you know what happened in 2016, Brexit happened. Donald Trump was elected president. Those two things were probably the most shocking things in recent times in our neck of the woods anyway. So I'll talk more about the upcoming one now because we're going to have another Jupiter-Rahu conjunction. So on May 27th, to be exact, if we use the mean node, Jupiter conjoins Rahu at 8 degrees of Sidereal Aries. So 8 degrees of Aries this time. This is known as Guru Chandala Yoga in Vedic astrology, the shadow of Rahu overshadowing the growth of Jupiter. So Jupiter in this context, if I'm just using it in this context, I could use it in any context, but if we're talking about the stock market, then Jupiter is about growth in the stock market. The problem here is that Rahu tends to inflate and then completely deflate things. So it's extreme. It makes highs and lows. And so what we're likely to see is a bubble situation again in May and June, I guess, that whole period. And that lead to further crashes, basically. And this is exactly the same thing that happened in 1929. So the last time Jupiter and Rahu got together in Sidereal Aries was in 1929. In May of 1929, they conjoined in Aries. There was an eclipse there in Aries, same as we have now. And that year had not just one crash, it had several smaller crashes leading up to that major crash in October. So it's likely we're going to see something similar in 2023. So here's a news report I just grabbed the other day, March 29th, from RTE News. This is the Irish News Network. The economy is set to grow more strongly this year than has been expected and may even overheat, which is an interesting turn of phrase for Aries, according to the latest quarterly bulletin from the Economic and Social Research Institute. So this is where the problems start. And it might look like it's not a problem in the beginning, but the kind of inflation and bubble situation that's created and the market inflations that are created earlier in the year is what's going to create the downturn later, I believe. So, and this is taken from this is a really interesting channel actually to look up, the Academy of Ideas. And I think it's a really good video to watch around this whole dynamic. And that is of, let me just make sure everybody is muted. That is of how inflation enriches politicians and the 1%. So this is the whole thing. Inflation is like a tax on the poor, essentially. And so basically we get this just deepening divide between the rich and poor. And so it gets to a certain extreme and then it has to all just kind of crash down around us. So basically we have to see though that this is actually necessary. So a crash is necessary, in other words, and recession has always been also part of the story. We need it. So the depression phase is actually the recovery phase, actually. And depression in this case just means that you have a recession for 3 consecutive years. I think that's all that means. Most people would be happy to keep the boom period where the inflationary gains are visible and the loss is hidden and obscure. But the latter periods do not cause the trouble. The trouble occurs during the boom, when malinvestments and distortions take place. This is Jupiter and Rahu coming together. The crisis depression phase is the curative period. So this is from Murray Rothbard, the Man, Economy and State, a treatise on economic principles. So they refer to this in this video, and I would highly recommend you watch that video by the Academy of Ideas, How Inflation Enriches Politicians and the 1%. It explains inflation, how we need it explained in, just simple terms. So let's compare May 1929 and May 2023. So this is, again, it's just a repeating pattern. And you can see here, there are lots of things that are different about this as well, but there are 2 significant things that are the same. And they're both good and bad in both, right? So this is the 1929 one. They conjoined at 28 degrees of Sidereal Aries. This was just before an eclipse, because the moon is going to join the sun here. And of course, when the sun has already joined the nodes, Rahu Ketu, and the moon joins it, that's a solar eclipse. The other similarity is that the ruler of Aries was in Cancer at the time, in debilitation. And by the way, Mars rules real estate. So, and you can connect that with Ketu as well, because, oftentimes it's said that Mars rules land and then Ketu rules buildings. So anyway, Mars and Ketu is a big signature of crashes, and I'm going to show you that in a while. But this is another signature that we're going to have this year. So this is this year, May this year. They conjoin at 8 degrees of Sidereal Aries. The sun will have moved on, so we'll already have had the eclipse. We're having a total solar eclipse, or a hybrid eclipse, solar eclipse, on the 20th of April in Aries. But you see here, Jupiter and Rahu come together, and Mars again moves into Cancer. And not only that, this time it's opposing Pluto in Capricorn. And we'll get to this in a while, but Pluto now is stationed on the 1st of May. It stations at 6 degrees of Capricorn, which is actually the degree of Pluto in the American independence chart. So this is why, because like the other point is, well, where is this going to happen? What, like, is it the, Wall Street, or where is it? Is it the US? Because we could talk about an Asian stock market crash. We could talk about different countries. It's likely the US, the dollar. So for this reason, the Pluto return especially. So that's about, all they have in common. Oh yeah, one other thing, major thing, of course, have in common, and I said it anyway, is the eclipse. So Rahu is here in Aries, Ketu in Libra. Same thing as we have now, Rahu in Aries, Ketu in Libra. And Mars, by the end of the year, by October, on October 5th, will join Ketu in Libra. And then in November, by the end of November, 27th, 28th, Venus will join Ketu in Virgo in its sign of debilitation. And before any of that, Venus goes through this back and forth, a retrograde in the summer between Cancer and Leo. It's a highly complex year in terms of the economy all year for that reason. I'll get to that in more detail in a minute. So the other thing that's happening as well, though, that's really interesting, is that Mercury and Jupiter are both retrograde through the same degree, the same zone of the zodiac, and that is 21 degrees back to 11 degrees of Sidereal Aries. They're both doing the same thing, but Mercury starts this off the day after the eclipse on the 21st of April. It moves retrograde until May 15th. Throughout that period, it's going back through this zone that Jupiter will then retrograde through from September 4th until the very last day of the year, December 31st. So this is telling me when Jupiter goes retrograde and behaves more like Rahu, we're going to see that kind of, again, this extreme situation, and inflating and then deflating the whole situation. And when Jupiter, as it is right now, is in any way afflicted, there isn't growth. And if there is growth, it's like a hot air balloon when we add it into Aries. So at the moment, it's like a really hot air balloon because it's actually combusts. We can't see Jupiter. It's hidden behind the sun. And at the same time, it's moving into Aries. And so there's this juncture now that's moving across this juncture between Pisces and Aries in the next few weeks. And then by September into the autumn, then it goes retrograde. And through the same section of the zodiac that Mercury will retrograde in April, May. So whatever is set up now, in other words, in April, May, is what is going to lead to that later on in autumn. So before we get into the exact degrees of the eclipses, I want to just mention this really important configuration that's happening all summer as well, and that is Pluto squaring the nodes. So Pluto, again, retrograde stations on May 1st until it stations direct on October 11th, and it does so from 6 degrees back to 3 degrees of sidereal Capricorn. And you can see here that that's a bit of an issue because of the Mars opposition, like I said, in May and June, but then also the square to the nodes in Aries and Libra. And they hold that square very tightly all summer because Pluto goes retrograde and the nodes are always retrograde if you use the mean calculation. So basically, we have a very sort of out of control, unforeseen, maybe perhaps feeling fated set of circumstances that are going to happen all summer. And when we add this to the economic outlook, it doesn't look good for things staying together. We do have one last hope, and that is Saturn. And I'll talk about that in a while. But really, it just looks like there's a major shakeup going on here in so many world things that, whether it's escalation in war, whether, we can see what's happening in the Pacific Ocean right now with China and Taiwan. These kinds of things really shake the markets as well. We have to think about everything is connected. So let's go to the eclipses then. So this is the hybrid. It basically is a hybrid, and it's quite rare to have a hybrid, basically, because it starts off as an annular, like there's a ring around the sun, and then it moves to a total. So it's hybrid. So you have it on the 20th of April. It's at 5 degrees of Sidereal Aries, the lunar mansion Ashwini. Look where it is. This is the same region that we had, this same region we had the eclipse, or they had the eclipse back in May of 1929 in the Pacific. So the fact, though, that it's in the Pacific, it's not a total solar eclipse for Taiwan, China, but it is a partial. So, it's a bit kind of, it's obviously shaking things up there. And we can see the tension building. And even just in the last 2 days, we can see what they're doing in terms of military might with China and Taiwan. Then there is 2 weeks later, a partial lunar eclipse at 20 degrees of Sidereal Libra. This is May 5th. I'm going to focus on the solar eclipses because this now eclipse on October 14th at 26 degrees of Sidereal Virgo, it goes right through the US and down into South America. But I want you to just pay attention to where it's going through the US. And I'm going to show you a diagram of what it does. It cuts the country in half from one side, moving this direction. And that's in October. They're calling these eclipses, these 2 sets of eclipses, the October eclipse and then the following April 2024 eclipse, the Great American Eclipses. So this is a partial lunar eclipse 2 weeks after that. And then in March, we have a partial lunar eclipse in Virgo. And then look at this April one. Just look at the path. Again, cutting through the US. And in both instances, this one's at 25 degrees of Pisces, by the way. In both instances, it cuts through, let me just show you this diagram. It cuts through Texas in both. So this is the Great American Eclipses. An annular solar on October 14th this year, and then the total solar on April 8th next year. So it's literally cutting the country in two. The last time that happened was when Donald Trump was elected. So you can see here that this is definitely going to shake things up in the US. And that's, again, why I think that when we're talking about the economy and the shakedown and the meltdown, potentially, it's likely the US stock market. Reminder, here are the degrees. So if you want to look at how these may be personally affecting you, of course, I'm not talking about personal charts here. It's all about mundane world events. But you can here have a pause. If you're doing this live, you can watch the playback and pause and just take note of each degree. I want to say something about this, though, before we go on, because I'm going to present here a slide also where, actually, I'll just show you the slide, actually. It's this one. Really fascinating. Somebody who just literally just started following me, who posted something on one of my videos, the 2023 prediction video I made, and talked about this Smita or Samita. It's the last year of the 7-year cycle. They have 7-year cycles in the Jewish calendar. So I was just fascinated to watch this video. You can watch it yourself. His name is David Garcia, and you can watch this video. It's a very short video and explains really succinctly the upswing and the downswing in the markets according to this 7-year cycle. And it's fascinating to watch. And these are the more recent 7-year cycles. So what he says in the video, though, is that every 7 years we have this major adjustment in the markets. And let me just go back to this for a minute. When it goes, this is what he says. So I've always wondered about this because there are different ways of looking at this. But when it goes from a solar to a lunar, so when the solar starts the sequence and goes to a lunar, he says that's a downturn in the markets. That has always been a downturn in the markets. But when it goes from then next year, a lunar to a solar, as it will do next year, that's an upswing in the markets. So he is predicting, and to the day, and this is what I find fascinating because obviously I'm using my own techniques and looking at the dates. He is predicting that November 27th is the very bottom of the market this year, based on these cycles. Because he says that it always happens, it bottoms out a year after this 7-year cycle. So a year after this cycle finishes, you get a 7-year cycle and it finishes, and there's like a reboot. And this, if you want to read more about this Shemitah year, basically, it's very much about, it's a very traditional Hebrew Jewish calendar where they would use it for agriculture and plant crops for 6 years and then give the land rest for the 7th year. And it ties in with that as well. But it just correlates very clearly with the market upswing and downswing. So he's predicting November 27th. So November 27th is the exact conjunction of Ketu and Venus at its degree of debilitation. And Venus, of course, is all about money. So it's like I was just kind of, wow, I had to really kind of sit up and listen to that. So I kind of disappeared down a rabbit hole today looking at all of this, but you can do the same yourself. This is that Shemitah year. So let's go back to the American independence chart, because why I think it's going to be the American economy. But then again, if it's the dollar and the American economy, that's going to affect the world, of course. So it's not going to be isolated to one region or, so that is because of the eclipses I showed you being visible in the US, number one, but also because of this Pluto return. So this is the American independence chart. 6 degrees of Capricorn, we see Pluto retrograde. And that's going to do the exact same thing for the very first time in history, because this is 1776 and Pluto hasn't been here since 1776. It's the first time it's returning to its position since American independence. So basically, this is a big deal. And a lot of astrologers, of course, are talking about this. But we are now there because in April, May this year, 2023, Pluto has reached 6 degrees of Capricorn. It hasn't reached the minute by exact degree, so astrologers are not referring to that right now. And by the way, there's a difference here with tropical and sidereal calculations because, of course, with the Ainamsha, the difference of degrees, it's going to shift Pluto. And so there's a very different calculation based on the tropical zodiac. But using sidereal calculations, the exact conjunctions, there are 3 of them, occur next year. February 22nd, July 17th, and December 30th. But again, remember, it's at 6 degrees, so it's pretty much exact right now. And so when you add this into everything else, it's just one thing after another. So that's the US. So let's get into some of the historic crashes and some of the aspects. And in this case, you don't actually even need to think about tropical or sidereal zodiac and different signs. You can just look at what I'm focusing here more so on, and that is conjunctions and oppositions. So first of all, I'm just going to whiz through these ones because there's so many and I didn't want to go too far back, but basically in the 1900s or in the 1800s, you see here, like it happens all the time. So that's another thing I want to remind you, that it happens all the time. And in a way, that's a thing that we have to be conscious of, that this is just a repeating pattern over and over. And in a way, we have more tools at our disposal that can self-correct things. And we also have more awareness how to deal with things. Now, we also have more complex dynamics going on in this day and age that can, be a minus in that sense, a negative. But we always have to look at both, right? So there's a panic of 1819, 1825, 37, 47, 57, 66. It just keeps repeating, right? Black Friday was 1869, panic of 1873 that led to a depression in the United States and much of Europe, crash of 1882, 1884, 93, and 1901. I'm not going to go through all of those. I'm going to focus on these ones from 1900 on. So 1907. Now, I'm just pulling out the main characteristics. There's many more things you could look at in each of these charts. But anyway, 1907, there was a Rahu, Neptune, Pluto conjunction. Ketu and Uranus were also conjunct, and Venus was in Virgo. Now, what you're going to start seeing are patterns, but they're not always going to be exactly the same, but you are going to see something, and it has to be something. As above, so below. There has to be some major pattern that's going on for a stock market to crash, because a stock market doesn't crash unless there's a wave of panic. That's why they call them in the past panic of, right? So 1907, Rahu, Neptune, Pluto conjunct, Ketu, Uranus conjunct, Venus and Virgo. That's a panic for sure. This one is very common. It's going to come up again and again. Mars, Ketu conjunction, and it's happening again this year. It happened in 1929. It's happening again this year. Same setup, same place. Pluto Saturn was in opposition at the time, and we don't have this now, thankfully. But of course, we've recently had a Pluto Saturn conjunction since 2020 until 2023. So, we're kind of over that hump in one way. So that's more positive. And I'm going to talk about Saturn actually as the more positive indicator in the whole thing, which is really unusual to talk about Saturn in that way. But Saturn is kind of coming to save the day, hopefully. Again, Venus and Virgo. That's going to happen again this year. Happened in 1929. It's going to happen again. But not only that, this time it's going to happen with Venus and Virgo conjunct Ketu at its exact degree of debilitation. So I don't want to be like a fearmonger or like be overly dramatic, but like this is unheard of this year. So, and of course, the main thing is, of course, that the eclipses happened in the same signs in 1929 as they did now. I forgot to actually put in here that actually there was the Jupiter Rahu conjunction, because that's what's happening again this year. That's the other thing, the Guru Chandala Yoga I mentioned. So that's 1929. There's so many similarities between 1929 and 2023 that I just cannot see how this could play out in any other way than a crash. But again, we just have to be hopeful that Saturn comes to save the day and contains the whole situation. 1937 to 1938, Jupiter and Capricorn. That's not unusual. Jupiter goes into Capricorn every 12 years. So that's why you have a downturn every 12 years, pretty much. And that's why you had a downturn in 2008. And then 12 years later in 2020, Jupiter is about growth. Jupiter in Capricorn restricts growth. Simple as. 1962, Saturn Ketu conjunction. There wasn't a lot more than that going on I could pull out, but it's still irrelevant. And by the way, that's going to be relevant in the future. Saturn Ketu conjunction in Taurus in the beginning of the 2030s. I'll talk more about that at the very end. 1973, Mars Neptune conjunction, but again, Jupiter in Capricorn. Every time Jupiter goes into Capricorn, there's a recession. Pretty much every time. And if it's not a recession, it's a downturn of some kind. 1987, Mars Ketu conjunction again. And we're having this again this year. Pluto, Venus, Mercury conjunction. Mars Ketu conjunction 1992. Again, same. You can see it keeps coming up. Neptune, Uranus, Rahu conjunction. Again, Venus and Virgo, 1992. 1997, another crash. Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune conjunction. Again, Jupiter in Capricorn. You see, there's just patterns, the same patterns over and over again. Jupiter, I just want to again mention why Jupiter and Venus. Jupiter is growth, remember? Venus is money. So in the context of the economy, Jupiter is growth in the economy, obviously, but Venus is literally money and all the good stuff. So, and the good feeling vibes as well. At the end of the day, crashes don't just happen. People make them happen. 2000 and 2002. Then we had it over this whole period. 2000, it was the dot-com bubble, right? Ketu, Uranus, Neptune conjunction. That's kind of crazy. And that was all that fear around the dot-com bubble. Then again, Mars, Ketu conjunction, 2001. But that was, of course, the whole 9/11. Sun, Mars, Venus, Mercury, so including especially Venus and Virgo in 2002. So that was the aftermath in a way. And we're having a similar thing this year, the kind of aftermath after the Mars Ketu conjunction. In October, we'll have the Venus Ketu conjunction in November. And then this whole period from 2007 to 2011 and the crash here. So the most obvious are like the 2008 time. And that is Jupiter conjoined Pluto this time, and then moving into Capricorn. So it conjoined Pluto at the very end of 2007 and then entered Capricorn in 2008. And basically it did this thing where it's doing this thing again. It joined all of the outer planets. So it joined Uranus, Rahu and Neptune, first of all, in 2008 and 2009. Then it met Uranus in Aquarius and in Pisces in 2009, 2010. So you can see and Pluto, first of all. So Pluto and then Neptune and then Uranus. And it did the same thing this time. 2020 met Pluto. Then, just met Neptune. That's the inflationary cycle. And next year, 2024, it's going to meet Uranus before they both move into Taurus. That is a major shakeup of the world economy. I'll show you that in a minute. September 2018, again, no surprise, Mars Ketu conjunction, another crash. And again, 2020, 2021, another Mars Ketu conjunction. And this time the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto conjunction. So this was obviously the major crash that was in February, March 2020. And in 2021 was the Mars Ketu conjunction. So now what we're having this year, all of that to say, so you don't take my word for it, basically that these are repeating patterns. And we're going to see this again at the end of the year. Mars Ketu is going to conjoin, like I said, in October 5th to be precise. And then Venus is going to conjoin Ketu in Virgo, November 27th. And remember, this is the date that David Garcia mentioned in his video about the downturn in the cycles, in the eclipse cycles. So, and on top of that, again, Rahu, Ketu in Aries, Libra. Same repeating pattern as 1929. I'll show you the charts. But before any of that, and we look at the actual charts of October, November, which are highly complicated. Let's look at Venus retrograde, because before any of that, before Venus meets with Ketu and is debilitated in Virgo, conjoined the South Node Ketu, which removes things, and that is money. We're then looking at Venus retrograde all summer. So it's doing this thing where it goes into Leo on July 6th. It then goes back into Cancer August 7th, and then it goes back into Leo October 1st. Really, the whole summer into the autumn, Venus is going over that really sensitive juncture between Leo and Cancer. So it'll backtrack from the 4-degree mark of Leo to the 18-degree mark of Cancer. Remember, these are sidereal signs. And this juncture between Leo and Cancer is highly volatile. And every time Venus goes through this juncture between fire and water signs and back into fire, back into water, back and forth, it creates major wobbles in the economy. And the last time it did that from Pisces to Aries was the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. So you can literally time it like clockwork. And so we're going to see that all summer. Really complicated. So this is the Mars-Ketu conjunction on October 5th. Before we have the Venus-Ketu conjunction, this is the chart of the exact conjunction. The nodes are just about to finish up in Aries and Libra. And I always see that the nodes, by the time they're finished in a sign, they're at 1 degree at this point, but that means they're at the end of it because they go retrograde all the way from the end to the beginning, back to the beginning of the sign. It's like one last hurrah going on here, and it's really going out with a bang. And Ketu and Libra especially, because what is Ketu? Again, Ketu removes things, material things, and Libra is all about money also. It's ruled by Venus, but joined Mars, which is the significator of real estate. Again, I don't know how many times I pointed out to you that Ketu and Mars conjunction shows a crash. This is I think, inevitable. I mean, if it doesn't happen, I'm going to eat my hat. Actually, no, I'll eat all my hats because I've got quite a few hats. So that's Mars Ketu. I'm trying to throw in a bit of humor just to lighten the mood, but yeah, it's not easy listening, I'm sure. This is the Wall Street stock market crash on October 29th, 1929, just to remind you. They weren't exactly conjunct. And by the way, they don't have to be exactly conjunct for there to be a crash if we want to time it to the day. Oftentimes we can see a moon, and oftentimes I always see this Mercury get involved as well. And even if it's strong in Virgo, many times Mercury in Virgo triggers major events. But anyway, here you can see Mars, Ketu conjunct and the Sun debilitated, which is again what we'll have in October, November this year, happens every year. And Venus debilitated. So this is kind of more obviously a downturn. And anyone looking at this chart back in 1929, before this in October, as an astrologer, would have known that this was a major downturn. And they might not have predicted the kind of downturn it was, but they would have known if they were looking at the sidereal zodiac that this was going to be a major downturn. And now this is then finally the Venus Ketu on what date was that? Yeah, November 28th. So that'll be easy to remember. It's November 28th at 28 degrees of Virgo, pretty much at the exact degree of Venus's debilitation at 28 degrees. And Ketu is the exact same degree. So this is for me like the aftermath, though, after the Mars Ketu conjunction and after the nodes have moved out of Aries and Libra. So yeah, it's an aftermath in November. And it's maybe like it's said, like it's the low end, the sort of the market bottoming out after a major something crash or whatever. Because oftentimes as well, you have to remember that, you know, a crash is one thing because that would be reported on straight away. That's obvious. But the economy can have this kind of lag period, you know, so where, you know, they're reporting on the economy after the fact, you know, so you kind of get it in hindsight. But anyway, so Saturn to the rescue. This is not the typical thing to talk about with Saturn, but Saturn is a potential here to rescue everything. And what that might mean is that people are rescued from the situation because Saturn is in sidereal Aquarius. And there could be some major rescue packages. There could be some containment potentially here, and that's a positive. So Saturn in Aquarius aspects Aries and all the planets placed therein, including Rahu, Jupiter conjunction and all of that. So it could actually contain things, but is it able to contain it? You know, I don't, to that degree where it doesn't create problems. You know, it's not able to completely contain it, but I think it could help somewhat this point. This year, we shall see. So then looking forward, like further ahead, much further ahead in terms of how is this all going to pan out? Because I've been thinking about this a lot because I know that this year is going to be economically challenging, but I just don't get a sense though that this is like 1929 in other ways that, you know, we're leading to a Great Depression. I just get a sense more looking at the astrology is what I'm talking about, that there'll be rescue packages, there will be things that are put in place, and especially the cryptocurrency, whether it's a government central digitalized currency, whatever it is that's brought in to rescue the situation, a failing economy and failing stock market, whatever it is. I just feel like there are things put in place here that rescue things. So Jupiter is going to move into Taurus next year, and it will do so round about the same time as Uranus. Remember I said Uranus moved into Aries in 2016 and shook everything up from then? Now it's going to move into Taurus, and it's sidereal Taurus. So obviously tropical astrologers are talking about Uranus in Taurus for the last few years, and the change in the currencies and all of that is quite evident. It's very evident, right? But when it then actually moves into the sidereal sign, which is more in line with the actual constellation Taurus, then we're likely to see more change and actual things being implemented at this point, whether by governments or whatever, but we're going to see some rescue plans and digital currencies and all of that. That's kind of like almost an obvious thing to say with Uranus and Taurus, but Uranus and Jupiter are both in Taurus. I think that's why I'm a bit more optimistic about what could be done here. And on top of that, Saturn in Aquarius though aspecting Jupiter while it's in Aries, it will no longer strongly aspect Jupiter in Taurus. It does have a square aspect, so it's quite strong, but not as strong as it aspects Aries. So at any rate, Saturn in Aquarius, again, I think that's the rescue packages to help people out, because Saturn in Aquarius is very much about helping everybody, whatever that means, whatever it looks like in whatever country. Then later on, we have the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Pisces 2025 to 2028, where I think there'll be a lull in the sort of more conflict situations that are going on in the world right now. But it also means that I think there are going to be a lot of things and systems that dissolve completely, that collapse in other ways. And let's face it, you're not going to be able to bring in a new monetary system or centralized digital currency without things collapsing in some way as well. It's just not going to be it's not going to be an easy switch. So in other ways as well, we have to look at this in terms of the Saturn Neptune in Pisces opposite the US independence chart. So I'm not going to go back to show you the chart, but basically take my word for it. Saturn Neptune were conjoined in Virgo during the American independence. It's going to oppose that now in Pisces by mid-decade. Again, that for me points to a kind of changing of things in a big way. Also, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin both have Saturn Neptune in Virgo. So they're going to have an opposition here with Saturn Neptune in Pisces. So that's a whole other in China and Russia. I've written articles about that if you want to read them, about revolutions that I think are going to come down at this period. Jupiter then goes into Cancer exalted, but then it also opposes Pluto in Capricorn by 2026. And don't think for a minute that Jupiter in Cancer just rescues everything, because in fact, I can show you that sometimes it doesn't. It actually leads to major revolutions and uprisings around the world. It doesn't necessarily mean a peaceful time. It means that people rise up and have more hope that they can change things when it's in Cancer. That's what Jupiter represents, it's hope. But when it opposes Pluto, I do think there's going to be a major uprising going on mid-decade when you combine that with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Pisces. When Saturn moves into Aries, then we're talking about war again, 2028 to 2030. And I could talk about the Venus retrograde that happens again at that time, and every 8 years it does this retrograde in the same place. And that links to the Russia invasion of first Crimea in 2014, and then again, the whole of Ukraine in 2022. So it's going to do that again in 2029. And when you add Saturn in Aries, that's the start of a major war again. So anyway, it might be that things kind of have a lull mid-decade, and then they pick up again end of decade. This is the most complicated though. In terms of the economy, in terms of the war, all of that, Saturn, Ketu, and Uranus conjoined in Taurus. And even though Saturn's out of Aries, at least, Saturn, Ketu, and Uranus in Taurus, the sign of the, money, the basics, can really challenge the very basics at this point. And again, it's likely because of a war. And, I have written an article on this called World War Astrology. So, I know I need to choose my words carefully, but I do believe we're already in a world war. It's just going to escalate and de-escalate and then further escalate at this point. So finally, then Saturn, Uranus in Gemini, another kind of complicated conjunction and configuration where we might see, I think things are going to be shaken up in the economy and in trade, because first of all, you have to put in things in place in Taurus, and the very basics have to be met. And that's likely because they aren't met when you have Saturn, Ketu, and Uranus in Taurus. And then when you have the basics, sorted, hopefully, or if you cannot sort them, then you have to come up with new systems of trade. And so what I'm saying here is that if we don't have a new currency by next year, a new system altogether, or the beginnings of one because of a crashing one, then by 2032, we just have to start, they will have to be implemented because of the major issues coming down with the war and all of that by 2030. And then finally, Pluto, as it does every 12 years, remember, move into Capricorn and a downturn again. 2020, it was in Capricorn. 12 years previously, 2008, it was in Capricorn. 12 years after 2020, of course, is 2032, right bang in this whole period where we're having a lot of upheaval on the planet and war situations and all of that. So It's going to be complicated for sure in the long term. Um, that's all I want to say. That's enough to say. I do want to plug a couple of things before I leave it for questions for those who are here live. I want to just say that I will have a book out very soon called Rahu Dasha. This is Rahu, the north node of the moon. It's, you know, um, apt at this time because we're coming up to a total solar eclipse or hybrid solar eclipse. So here we see a total solar eclipse. This is the 2017 eclipse on the cover, taken by NASA. So Rahu is the north node of the moon that creates the eclipse that I've been talking about. Dasha is the timeline that I call, but it's basically the planetary cycle of Rahu, which lasts 18 years in total if you go through the major cycle. And this is a book about how to not just survive that cycle, as many talk about, but actually thrive in it. So a guide to thrive, the Rahu Dasha. So it should be out in the next few weeks. Have a look out for it. It's going to be out on ebook and paperback, and you can check it out at timelineastrology.com. And then finally, everyone listening to this live, of course, is a patron. So I, again, want to thank you for your support. But if you are watching the playback and you're not a patron, consider joining up. I have daily reports and discussion groups. I'm going to have more of those discussion groups, philosophical discussion groups as well, or what we could call astrophilosophy in the future. And then also this Scorpio Video Club, where I share some of the secrets of predictive Indian astrology. So you can go to patreon.com/timeline astrology. Okay, that's all I have for you today. For those who are here live, I'm going to take some questions. So thank you all for coming and listening if you've watched this all the way through. And until next time.